Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 13th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then asking our colleagues to comment on it. At the end, we'll have time for Coburn's Corner, where we'll nominate cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20-some years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in American politics, in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. So we're cablecasting from Neptune on the 29th day of March, 2013. It's Passover and Good Friday. Passover is the first of Judaism's 3 pilgrimage festivals, a commemoration of the story from the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible of God's liberation of the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses. The underlying historical events are dated to the 13th century B.C. Good Friday is the commemoration in the Western Christian Church of the execution of Jesus of Nazareth by an occupying army in Palestine in the 1st century A.D. Scholars dispute about the circumstances of the death of Jesus of Nazareth, but 2 facts seem fairly well established. Jesus was executed by the Romans because they found him a threat to the precarious stability of their colony, and they were encouraged to do this because Jesus was rejected by the leaders of his own people. I think that in the end, the reason why he was thus rejected was that he claimed to speak with authority. That is, he regarded attachment to his own person as more significant even than belonging in the ordinary way to the people of God in accordance with the law. It was not, as modern exegetes, for so long enchanted by Martin Luther, used to believe, that Jesus preached a doctrine of God's grace, which is opposed to the law and legalism of the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition itself is a tradition of God's generous love and freely given covenant with his people, and the vast majority of Jewish people in the time of Jesus were not legalistic at all. The trouble for Jesus and for the members of the early church was that they, Jews themselves, held that believing in the individual man Jesus, in other words, being what the Apostle Paul called in Christ, was not just an alternative to the Mosaic covenant, it was the actual flowering and fulfillment of that covenant. For that reason, the Apostle Paul was willing to accept even non-Jews as he said, members of Christ's body, without requiring they become members of the covenant people by circumcision. Indeed, he thought it was a betrayal of the good news to demand that they become subject to the law in this way. So you're listening to News from Neptune on Passover and Good Friday, the Liberation and Occupation edition. And Ron Szoke is here to lead us out of captivity in the Egypts of our mind.
Well, I will begin talking about a different kind of
he does that every week.
Bondage.
Exactly.
Which some might call debt bondage, that a lot of today's students and presumably tomorrow's leaders are finding the manacles closing in around their wrists, I think, but we'll see. What I'm alluding to is what I mentioned last week, is the crisis of, if it is a crisis, everyone uses that term so loosely, financing higher education, and how the present structure is keeping out a lot of very talented lower income students, although there are elaborate measures in place supposedly to deal with this problem, and yet the stories have started to come out that more and more of them find it impossible or very highly difficult to go on to higher education. And of course, we've been told that you must get a college education in order to get a good job. So many people have gone deeply into debt in the student loan arena and get out and find that they still don't have jobs. So what to do about that? Well, I mentioned one thing that's being tried last week. Students get investors and not loans. So this is an innovation in financing one's higher education. You can sell a piece of yourself. People can buy that share of you, and you give them a contract. You will pay them off in 10 years, or maybe you'll have to roll over the loan. But whatever it is, this is an opportunity for people to get financing for higher education by, in effect, incorporating themselves or persuading other people to invest in them. And you're supposed to get additional benefits, of course, of advice and other kinds of possible help from these investors when you do that. So the financing of higher education has long been a problem with the corporatization of the university that some see going on. It may be an even bigger problem. It's apparently the source of these scandals that keep erupting every few months when it's discovered that some co-ed has been paying her way through college by becoming the close companion of some wealthy man and has acquired a sugar daddy. And this seems to be an essential accompaniment of capitalism around the world. There were stories recently of young women in Hong Kong who were engaging in what was called compensated dating. Well, you could get a date with them for an agreed upon price, and of course there would be no account of what happened on that date. So this is one of the things that we've come to.
No pun intended.
Yeah, right. Another indication is the
trying to be
honored
so delicate
speakers.
too, wasn't it?
Yeah, the honored speakers at the University of Illinois. We found out that the commencement speaker is Mr. Khan, the multimillionaire owner of a local factory and indeed a number of factories. And it's just been announced, maybe David will mention this, an honored speaker at Beckman in the near future will be the former CEO of Lockheed Martin. The biggest defense contractor is going to tell us what the university must do to fit into the industrial society of the future. So there are stories starting to appear about these people and how they are, according to some, distorting the economy and what they're doing to this massive inequality that has come upon us. Another factor is the student loan interest rate, which is set to double from, what was it, 3.4 to 6.8% July 1st. Neither party is doing anything about this. The line being that we just don't have the money. We can't fit it into the budget, and we have to stop this spending. So the same loan that a student's older sibling got a few years ago will cost about $5,000 more to the student starting July 1st. So Paul Krugman's column today reflects this also. It's headed Cheating Our Children. And he says, we are indeed cheating our children in the longer run, as what he calls the deficit scolds are claiming. How are we doing this? By neglecting public investment and failing to provide jobs. You don't have to be a civil engineer to realize that America needs more and better infrastructure, that is the roads, the bridges, and so on. The report of the civil engineers, American Society of Civil Engineers, makes this clear. What about investing in our young, he says. We're cutting back there, too, having laid off hundreds of thousands of school teachers and slashed the aid that used to make college affordable for children of less affluent families. Last but not least, think of the waste of human potential caused by high unemployment among younger Americans. For example, among recent college graduates who can't start their careers and will probably never make up for lost ground. Why are we shortchanging the future so dramatically and inexcusably? Blame the deficit scolds who weep crocodile tears over the supposed burden of debt on the next generation, but whose constant inveighing against the risks of government borrowing by undercutting political support for public investment and job creation has done far more to cheat our children than the deficits did. Fiscal policy, he says, is indeed a moral issue. We should not be ashamed. We should be ashamed of what we're doing to the next generation's economic prospects, but our sin involves investing too little, borrowing too much, not borrowing too much, and the deficit scolds, for all their claims to have our children's interests at heart, are actually the bad guys in this story. So it's becoming rather stark that all of the complaints about spending are a little misplaced, apparently by people who don't understand or don't want to understand macroeconomics and what must be done to sustain the economy and to invest in the future. So that gives you plenty to respond to, gentlemen, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. I want to thank David. Is the situation of student debt what the poet calls mind-forged manacles? Have we done this to our children, eh?
Yeah, this has been, this has been a conscious effort over the last 30 or 40 years, joined to the advent of credit cards as well and consumer debt. And this has extended the sort of, the empire of finance and financialization to where what we're talking about is the appropriation of resources, not only at the time, but throughout the lives of students and workers to pay off debts that and I guess the term that I want to bring into this would be that of rent seeking. I mean, we have an economy. We can't go into all the theoretical background for the role that rent seeking plays in capitalism and so forth. But generally speaking, it's a way of getting paid for not doing much, or getting paid for what you own rather than what you do or what you make. And it's a way of extracting money. And what one could see, the indebtedness of students to the banks as simply another form of rent seeking. These are phenomena that suck the productive resources out of the economy instead of investing them in ways that would put people to work and produce stuff and increase our real standard of living.
Is it true, gentlemen, as I seem to recall, that student debt in this country now is greater than mortgage debt, housing debt? that more money is owed on student loans than is on houses.
I've heard that also.
Yeah, and this, remember, I mean, we're talking about debt that less than a quarter of adults in America have college educations, eh? Slightly more than that may have been in college at some point, but we're still talking about a fraction of the American population who's rolled up this student debt. A good deal more people live in their own houses and have mortgage debt as a result. But this occurs in a situation in which it's been pointed out by the economist Doug Henwood, friend of this ground, that there is no reason, no economic reason, that higher education in this country couldn't be free. As it was in Britain, say, before the Blair government came into office in the 90s. It could be free, and in fact, Noam Chomsky picked up the point in a recent talk. And so it leads us to ask why it isn't, and particularly with the direction that David just referred to. And clearly one of the answers is that it's an aspect of that great neoliberal counterattack in the last generation against what is sweepingly called the 60s. High tuition and corresponding debt is there precisely to control the educational institutions which embarrassed the American rulership in the 1960s and 70s. You've got a quiescent student body, and a quiescent faculty too, I might say, across American education. And one of the ways that quiescence is maintained is by debt burden. It's working very nicely. Thank you.
I was informed by neighbors several years ago who were from Germany that until recently there, higher education was also free in Germany. You just had to get accepted, and it was all paid.
And that's right.
And you might note that Germany has since become the economic powerhouse of Central Europe, Western Europe.
I've heard actually from a German woman I know that not only was it not free, that she got paid to go to college.
Yeah.
And that's, we talk loosely about human capital. It's become a cliche and a slogan. I've gone in different ways about trying to understand what that means and what's real about human capital and what's kind of phony about the whole concept of it. But it gets us away from the idea that capital is what is it. I mean, capital in the classic sense is the ownership of the means of production. And the implication is that when people go to school and develop skills, they're becoming owners of their means of production. Well, that isn't exactly quite right as long as they have to sell their labor. Mm-hmm. They don't really own right. In the most correct form of human capital, I suppose somebody could have their own business and be using their skills, but they're still they could be producing a product and selling that product on the basis of those skills. But as long as they're selling their labor, somehow the notion of human capital and of education and schooling centered around the development of human capital, I think has led us astray in understanding, in a very general sense, understanding what the broader purposes of education are. But even in the narrow economic and vocational purposes, I think it's prevented us from thinking clearly about what that really might mean and how labor markets actually work.
At the very dawn of modern discussion, understanding of this economic system of the modern world that has, as it were, grown up, one of the first and most important analyses was the notion of alienation, that what the modern economy required was that for vast numbers of human beings, they had to give up control over what made them human, their work of head and hands. They can't control that anymore. They had to sell it or rent it to somebody else. And that was the original sin, if you like, of capitalism, in the sense that there was no democratic control over what made you human, your work. And the fundamental contradiction between capitalism and democracy is there at the origin, and it's not going away. It's still very much there today. And when we speak sweepingly of the conjunction of capitalism and democracy, we're suppressing the fact that they are contradictories.
Yeah, an interesting way to try to moderate that conflict is what's going on in France, where for a number of the major industries, apparently, the government owns a controlling interest in the stock of the company. And they're using this to keep down the compensation of the CEOs, which has become, completely absurd and out of sight in the USA, but more and more, I think, in Europe, they are beginning to see the consequences of that, how socially destructive it is, and trying to put some cap on CEO pay.
There are various experiments like this, some quite long-standing. The Mondragon enterprise in Spain, for example, that is a capitalist enterprise designed to give the workers greater control over what they do and make the sort of limitations you talk about, Ron. At the same time, the actions of the corporation are under a democratic, within limits, of course, democratic control. Gar Alperovitz has just published a book on similar attempts in this country, various forms of workers' control and so forth that move in that direction. But I think we have to understand that this is, not sort of plants flowering under the sun. This is a class struggle. That what we see going on here is a critique of the neoliberal attempt for a generation to produce a capitalism with the gloves off, for which these things are clearly contradictories.
Yeah. Do you see any fundamental problem with the government owning a large or controlling share of the stock in all the major industries? The biggest corporations.
Someone that question.
That's not going all the way to socialism.
Yeah.
But it is a very interesting idea, it seems to me.
Well, a real discussion about socialism and the varieties of capitalism is a consummation devoutly to be wished. But the notion of the government owning the French model that you sketched and so forth raises the issue, of course, of who the government is and who controls that government.
Yeah.
I mean, the original Soviet notion was that the government, which it represented the working class, was the effective employer and director of the state industry.
So what may happen is that Goldman Sachs, in effect, owns the government.
Well, there's certainly plenty of indications recently that that's a direction that we're moving in.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's practical issues that have to do with understanding what really would make a meaningful difference and what wouldn't. And I know, Carl, you mentioned Doug Henwood before, who's I read his Left Business Observer and his listserv to a certain extent, and he often provides a sort of refreshing alternative, or perhaps refreshing to some people anyway, alternative perspective on some of the proposals that are made. Recently, there's a woman named Ellen Brown who's been publishing articles on common dreams, and who's someone who is an innovative thinker in terms of public banking and so forth. And Doug Henwood doesn't think a whole lot of Ellen Brown, if you've read any of her work about public banking, and in the context of some of comments she made in the recent Cyprus affair, and what might happen, how that might happen in this country. I think that Doug Henwood has basically said that this just shows a failure to understand how it is that capitalism is really working. Also, in relation to movements to take money out of certain banks and put them into other banks, Doug Henwood has also been rather cynical about that. It isn't that he thinks it's a bad thing to do, but that he just feels that for the left to strategize about moving money from one bank to the other bank is a pretty ineffectual way of challenging the financial system as a whole. So I recommend Henwood's views in various areas as a kind of reality check. He doesn't hold back in criticism of relatively like-minded people.
Well, just to take that example, I mean, you take your money out of Busey Bank and put it in the University of Illinois Credit Union and say, you know, okay, I've taken it away from a commercial bank and I've put it in this popular bank, this credit union. What does the University of Illinois do with your money? Don't they invest it back in the Busey Bank?
Yeah, smaller banks, their banks are large banks.
Exactly.
And the credit unions, you know, have their own accounts with the largest banks and so on. And then we're told that they are too big to fail, and their executives are too big to jail.
But not, you know, I mean, Ellen Brown is someone who's written many books on the notion of public banking and public ownership of banks, and I assume, you know, if you go into what she says, she's talking about the public making investing choices. But there's a certain discipline of capitalism that until we get to the root of that discipline and the profits, the need for profits, you know, I don't mean to give her short shrift. I'm not sure if Henwood is a general critic of her views. Well, he did call her a fraud. So maybe he doesn't think a lot of anything that she has to say. I'm not saying I believe that. But when looking at different sort of tactical approaches towards people wanting to do things, I think it's important to keep some of these things in mind in terms of understanding how it is that capitalism and financial capitalism is actually working.
I'm going to put a link to the Doug Henwood's Left Business Observer on our Facebook page, and if you want to follow out this discussion, including the one David is talking about, the particular one David's talking about, go to Facebook for News from Neptune and look at the links that will take you to the Left Business Observer. Doug's been doing that for many years, as a matter of fact, and it's quite remarkable that he has been as consistent and is devoted to producing this particular perspective. He knows what he's talking about, and the accounts are very much worthwhile. You're watching News from Neptune, and we'll go now to David Green with a change of scene, perhaps.
Yeah, and if you want, well, I won't change right off the bat, but if you want, you can download Doug Henwood's book, Wall Street, if you want a real challenging read, to say the least. And even though it was written in the late 90s, it doesn't, you know, it probably predicted the future as much as talked about the past at that point in time in terms of the aspects of financial capitalism that we've all come to know and love so much as it's destroyed the lives of so many of us. But I'm going to reach across the table
here. Just a note
here.
about that before we get into just about we're telling tales out of school here. Doug published that book with Verso Press, the press associated with the New Left Review in London, and he's not a fan of the Verso Press. He doesn't think he was treated very well by Verso. And there have been some interesting arguments about that. Verso has published a lot of interesting, more or less left literature in recent years, continues to do so, and is an interesting activity. But he found them a particularly cutthroat capitalist press to deal with. So the ironies are replete.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that. The Verso Press published a year or two ago a book called The Making of Global Capitalism by a couple of economists from Canada named Leo Panich and Sam Gindin, or Gindin. Do either of you know how that name is pronounced? Gindin. Doug Henwood, and you could go on, if you don't want to read the book, which I think is an important book, there's, among other things on YouTube, there is a talk that Panich and Gindin made with Doug Henwood at Brecht Forum a while back on the publication of this book. I think it's an important analysis, a difficult, extended analysis of how global capitalism has evolved with American leadership and ownership since World War II. And perhaps when I get more deeply into the book, I'll have some more to say about it, or maybe I could say a couple of things about it. But before I do that, I will go to a different topic, namely my letter to the editor in this morning's paper, which I will read the first paragraph. 10 years ago, the U.S. government lied its way into Iraq. On March 21st, 2003, News Gazette editors mendaciously wrote, quote, "It is a reluctant United States that goes to war with Saddam Hussein and the domestic and international terrorism he represents. Saddam and his henchmen are the only targets for Allied forces. They are the only reason that this costly and tragic war is being fought," end quote. So I don't usually like to call the News Gazette editors liars because they publish my stuff. But I just, at that particular point in time that I wrote that letter, and there was one of our interlocutors on the Peace Discussed, on the Aware Peace Discussed list, contacted me off list and said, "Wouldn't it be better if you said what you thought was true without calling people liars?" And it's true that we could talk about what lying means and what the motivation is, what the intentionality is, and whether it's useful to call people, whether it's even useful, even if people are liars, to call them liars in the bigger picture in which we're kind of lied to constantly at so many different levels that, it's hard to know what all that means. But in a 250-word letter, I thought it would have a good impact, at least to remind people that they're being lied to, and that when journalists simply pass along the government's lies, they might say that they were credulous or that they didn't have all the information they needed to analyze whether or not there were WMDs. It still seems to me that it's the responsibility of journalists to look into it, and it wasn't that hard for anyone at the time. Setting aside whether even if Saddam did have WMDs, whether that was a casus belli, which of course it's not. Our invasion of Iraq in 2003 was nevertheless a violation of the UN Charter, international law, the Geneva conventions, et cetera, et cetera. So there shouldn't be any doubt about this, and I think that explains the lack of comment on the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War that the News Gazette editors have had. And they're kind of, I always read sarcasm. We've been talking about sarcasm in recent weeks, mainly mine, but I always read a certain amount of sarcasm into the manner in which the News Gazette editors title the letters that they don't agree with. This one that I wrote is titled, "Big lies just keep coming at the public." As if who believes that? And the title to Carl's is again reading a little sarcasm into this. Carl had a letter in the same edition this morning. U.S. spending deficit is not a big problem. So the understanding is there anybody who reads the newspaper every day, how could you not think that U.S. spending isn't a big problem? So if you just say it that way, the sarcasm's implied. But in any event, thanks to Ron for cutting these things out of the paper, because I don't actually get a paper copy of the newspaper. So I used to keep files. Now I just keep internet files. But in any event, 10 years on, what is our evaluation of what's gone on in Iraq? I think there's many different perspectives that we can take in terms of how we define, as with any other war that we fought in the last 50, 100, 200 years, whether it's been successful, a failure, or success. And even on the left, there are debates about whether we call Iraq a success or a failure. The Chomskyan view, I think, is that whatever the human cost of these wars, there's always a certain element of success to the fact that we did it, and we showed the world that we're willing to do it and to continue to be willing to do it, because that's what we're all about.
Yeah, in some esoteric sense, others have claimed that we actually won in Vietnam.
Well, certainly that's true. Yeah. Vietnam was hardly a complete success from the point of view of the American government, the American ascendancy. Didn't achieve maximum war aims, after all. I mean, but if you think about what the purpose of the war was, against all the propaganda, against all the lying, And that brings us back to lying that the U.S. did about that war, as compare the lying it did about the current war. If you look at what the U.S. really set out to do in the 1960s in Vietnam, they set out to prevent the emergence of a government that would run its economy for its own people in a region that the U.S. was interested in, and in which the U.S. insisted that any government coordinate its economy with the U.S. worldwide control of the economy. These guys were talking about not doing that, and they had to be taught a lesson. The principal reason for the Vietnam War was a demonstration war to show to these countries around the world, particularly those run by little brown people, that they couldn't run their own economy and their own nation without our permission. We had picked out a perfectly good government for them, the way we did throughout Latin America, for example, and they should simply accept it. And we were willing to kill several million Southeast Asians because of their unwillingness to accept the government we picked out for them. Well, look, what happened when the smoke cleared, literally and figuratively, Vietnam was angling for Nike factories and doing its best to coordinate its economy with the worldwide economy run by the United States. That looks like success if you take, as it were, the long view of the American imperialists.
2 points. The best extended treatment of lying known to me is Cilla Block's book about what is lying, is it ever justified, and so on. A diplomat has been defined as someone who's sent abroad to lie for his country, for example.
Yes.
And to me, a lie is somewhat complicated matter. It's not just something that some statement that I dislike or disagree with. Second point is, wasn't there a Roman poet who said these days it's impossible not to write satire, in which I would include sarcasm. But.
And then on the other side, there's Tom Lehrer, who said that once they gave the Peace Prize to Henry Kissinger, political satire had died.
Yeah, that's
you couldn't do it anymore.
Self-parody.
Yeah. On the question of lying, I.F. Stone, one of the great reporters and political writers of the 20th century, had as his watchword the remark, "all governments lie." And he saw what he was doing mainly was ferreting out these liars. They denied him press credentials in Washington. And this was in the 1950s. And so he went around to the government printing office and simply got all the congressional hearings that the government printing office did as a matter of course and sat and read them. Yeah. He said, I just want to see what these liars are saying to one another. And when he began writing about that in I.F. Stone's Weekly, it was a revelation to Americans who, of course, had heard only the lies from their press. And this brings us back to the analysis of propaganda that we owe, in part at least, to Noam Chomsky, The Manufacture of Consent, where he points out that the contribution of the American 20th century in many ways was a matter of lying. That what happened in the course of the 20th century in America was that it became harder and harder to control populations and run them in the interests of the 1%, with police, prisons, the knout, beatings, etc. You couldn't do that quite so much. You had to find other ways to do it, and the way to do it was propaganda. The way to do it was to take up Steve Biko's notion that the strongest weapon in the hand of the strongest weapon that the oppressor has is the mind of the oppressed. And in that regard, if you tell them enough lies, if you get people believing enough lies, then you don't have to worry about the outcome. This propaganda campaign, this manufacture of consent, is exactly what we're supposed to be cutting through because this is the American way. I.F. Stone was right. But it means there's a lot of work to do, gentlemen.
Yeah, the original classic is Edward Bernay's book, explicitly titled Propaganda, and there was this notion among some intellectuals of the time in the early 20s, including Walter Lippmann, that we have a problem in coordinating the activities of a vast nation with many different groups and factions, and how can we ever get them together to support anything?
And I don't have any trouble, Ron, with talking about the lies, for example, told by our chief magistrate right now in regard to the war. I mean, Barack Obama was elected president the first time, and indeed the second time, too, in some ways, largely because people believed that he was against the war, that he would wind down the war. And he continues to say that he's winding down the war when he is, in fact, lying. He's not doing that. And the lies were necessary to get him elected, if you want to put it that way, and the lies continue. And it seems to me that we're, to avoid calling these by their right name is a mistake, at least.
Well, when it gets to the point when you can talk about democracy, about promoting democracy by invading other countries and lying to your own people, that somehow out of all this undemocratic activity we still cling to our democratic ideals and goals. On the one hand, it's so much a part of the conventional wisdom that whatever we do is inspired in some way or other by these democratic ideals. But it's also so transparent that, as Chomsky points out, or he usually refers to a Latin American scholar named Thomas Carruthers, who did a study on the effects of, back in the 80s and 90s, of our effects on Latin American policy, that wherever the governments did what we wanted them to do, they were were increasingly democratic. But whenever they didn't do what we wanted them to do, then we supported dictators and people who murdered their own people and stuff like that.
In your letter this morning, David, you refers to this usage of Latin American dictators, and by that we mean elected presidents who are all elected with great majorities much greater than any American president has been elected in a long time, even those that actually did have majorities.
One thing that got edited in that regard, one thing that got edited out of my letter this morning, not to quibble about this or whatever, but it's I had made it clear in my letter that heading using the word dictators had been written by news Gazette editors. I mean, that wasn't on this man, Andres Oppenheimer, whose column that was in reference to. The title wasn't on the original column or given by him. The News Gazette editors chose to use the word Latin American dictators in a column that talked about the leaders of Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, all elected leaders. So if that isn't a lie, then I don't know what is.
Exactly. Here. But right. You're watching News from Neptune with lying on the table, so to speak. We'll move to the last segment of our program, Coburn's Corner, where we deal with lies, particularly those encapsulated in specific words and small bits of language. This is in reference to the late Alexander Coburn's last publication, a pamphlet called Guillotine, in which he nominated cliches, overused phrases, and tedious words for elimination, most of them having a political dimension. And we try to carry on his great work here by adding our own suspects to this kill list, which is a good deal less personally or lethal than the kill list that our president seems to be maintaining. You got some nominees for the kill list, Ron?
Yes. This week, maybe surprisingly, it's the phrase common sense.
Common
sense.
What a pain.
Is invoked to justify the views of a lot of people who are spouting nonsense, silly, one-sided, absurd. I vowed to stop using the word silly to refer to other people's statements. But anyway, the problem there is that the most ignorant and confused people believe and uneducated people particularly, believe themselves to be uniquely chock full of good old sturdy foursquare, feet on the ground, common sense when they're talking just utterly ignorant and absurd stuff. And what can we do about that? Around 1600, René Descartes, the philosopher, wrote that everyone believes himself to have as much, all the good sense that he needs. Nobody wants any more of it, it seems, than he already has. So how can this be? Well, is good sense the same as common sense? I'm not sure. But I've never read a good extended analytical discussion of what common sense is supposed to be. If there were things about politics, economics, and so on that were the deliverances of common sense, then there should be a substantial agreement about them on all sides, everyone. But that is obviously not the case. So what are these people doing, claiming that their views are the result of common sense? Sarah Palin, for example, advocating what she calls common sense conservatism for some of the wackiest ideas that have ever seen the light of day. But anyway, what do you think of common sense, and how do we judge who has it and who doesn't, and what does it say about fundamental political and economic issues? Gentlemen?
David, you want to take a crack at common sense?
No, there's. I mean, your basic point is taken. I would only, well taken. I would say that I'm wary of the notion of ascribing to the majority of people a claim to having common sense. I think it's just as often, in a political context, it's often a quality ascribed to people with a motive who are patronizing, who are a kind of a faux populism, that they are appealing to common sense when they're only appealing to selfishness or you know, the idea, as Carl talked in his letter about this more, the idea that the government needs to balance its checkbook the way a family needs to balance its checkbook. Well, that might be seen to be common sense, and whether or not people understand this or not, it's certainly well-educated people like our congressperson, Mr. What's his name, Davis?
Davis,
who is foisting this upon us. And he probably went to college, I suspect.
Right. Well, that's what common sense is what you invoke when you really have no case and nothing else to support what you're saying.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's another sign of people's failure to understand or to believe in macroeconomics and trying to equate the national economy to a kind of household economy and then going on to commit the fallacy of composition. But the economics textbooks warn us against. But
one of the first publications by Noam Chomsky that attracted attention outside of the area of his professional expertise in linguistics was an article entitled "The Responsibility of Intellectuals," and in that article, still very much worth reading. In fact, on some version of the things we've been talking about today: lies, propaganda, common sense, what have you. One of the things he says is that one of the first responsibilities of intellectuals is to expose lies and may produce a conversation, a dialogue that will lead to accurate descriptions of what actually is going on. That seems to me to be right, and it's a consummation devoutly to be wished for us to do that sort of thing when we start talking about politics in this country. Appeals to common sense may be fine at the beginning of a discussion. If we all have that common sense, let's pool our common sense and show that all of us are smarter than some of us. I hope it's true.
yeah, what it turns out to mean is widespread bigotry and confusion and so on when people start talking about common sense. So that may be a good starting point, but it's never, it seems to me, the ending point or the last analysis, as it's called.
David, you have a nominee for the for Coburn's Corner?
Yes, I brought in the term nonpartisan.
Okay,
And,
that's good. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm beginning to notice a theme here, gentlemen.
And it probably isn't fair to everyone who uses that term to describe, say, their think tank or their views, but one certainly needs to be skeptical in reading the newspaper when a think tank or organization, an NGO or whatever, is referred to. I mean, it doesn't always have to be specifically referred to as nonpartisan for us to be skeptical about what its interests and motives are. But in the lexicon of American politics, the assumption is that there are two points of view, Democrat, Republican. A claim to nonpartisanship is a claim to not being loyal to either of those parties. And I would suggest that there's a lot more to insight and wisdom than simply basing one's claim on a nonpartisan, as being nonpartisan in that sense. It would probably, a good synonym for nonpartisan would be in many instances, corporate. I mean, there's plenty of corporations various corporations with various interests that fund various think tanks, foundations, and so forth, which are nonpartisan, but that stay very well within the limits of allowable, allowable debate.
Yeah. Objection is to bipartisan.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Doubly partisan?
Well, I could have said both.
Partisan twice. Yeah.
I think that nonpartisan is more commonly used in talking about, in sort of making a claim to somehow being above the Democrat-Republican. And that will, of course, include this fixing the debt nonsense, this Alan Simpson, this Bowles-Simpson stuff, which is a nonpartisan effort
that's bipartisan,
to make poor elderly people even poorer.
Right. My candidate, gentlemen, fits this theme. It seems to me very well. It's one of the biggies. It's one of the major examples of chat in the political area. My candidate is progressive. I want to go after progressive. Alex Coburn, as a matter of fact, as I said, this theme, this feature is named in his honor, made that one of his particular concerns. Indeed, long before he wrote his pamphlet about consigning language to the guillotine, he used in his columns refer to progressives as PWOGs, P-W-O-G-S, basing himself on certain English accents of people who held the views that he usually excoriated as progressive or as PWOG. But it's come up again in a new way, well, not a new way, it's come up again recently in an important article that appeared in Counterpunch by John Stauber, who's been writing about politics and language in America for some time. He has a piece in Counterpunch this month entitled "The Progressive Movement as a PR Front for Rich Democrats." And I recommend it to you highly. I'll put a link to this. I think there's already a link to this on our Facebook page as well. This is an important article. He's talking about something a lot of other people have talked about, but he's making the point. And it's come up actually in a local discussion on some local email lists a lot in the last week and two. Progressive is an attempt, it's an attempt to cover over the very real split between liberals and the left in this country. Liberalism, in the American sense, has a rather remarkable career over the last generation. I recommend nothing better than Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class to figure out what's going on there. But there's a great attempt to use progressive to elide any difference between liberal and left and ignore the fact that left must finally mean anti-capitalist if it's to have any consistency of meaning at all, and that's not the position of American liberalism at all these days. Stauber has one particular example of this distinction, or of this attempt to cover over this distinction, in his argument that is in fact rich Democrats, members of the 1%, if you like, who have been pressing this progressive interpretation of American politics that gave us, for example, Barack Obama. He points out, and this is Estabrook, in early 2007, the truly dark and cynical agenda of the professional progressive movement and the Democratic Party revealed itself. Under Pelosi, the Democrats could have cut off funding for Bush's unpopular wars and foreign policy. Instead, with PR cover provided by Move On and their lobbyist Tom Matzey, the Democratic Congress gave George Bush all the money he wanted to continue his wars. For the previous 5 years, Move On had branded itself as the leader of the anti-war movement, building lists of millions of liberals, raising millions of dollars, and establishing itself in the eyes of the corporate media as leaders of the U.S. peace movement. Now they help the Democrats fund the war, both betting that the same public opposition to the wars that helped them win control of the House in 2006 would win the presidency in 2008. And indeed it did. And it seems to me that this co-option of the anti-war movement that produced Barack Obama's presidency was a lie for openers, and it was covered over with this cloak of progressivism. True progressives were behind this movement.
Yeah, well, what words do we have left to use? They all become sullied and essentially meaningless. That's why they're useful as slogans, is they have no definite meaning. But the career of the term liberal over the last 2 centuries, as a matter of fact, is an interesting topic in itself. And it now seems to mean pretty much the opposite of what it meant in the 19th century.
It's worthwhile to sort a lot of that out, particularly if we were going to try to bring to public attention this neoliberal campaign that has really defined politics for a generation.
Yeah, I mean, these words may not have a real and eternal meaning, but it's really illuminating to see how they've evolved historically, and it helps us to understand what they've come to mean or not mean. And obviously, there's always propagandistics and ideological meanings, but you can get. I find especially this essay we've been talking about a little bit for the last couple of weeks, Government in the Future, that Noam Chomsky made back in 1970, that you can actually listen to it on YouTube. It talks about the origins of liberal and what it meant to be classically liberal and anarchist and so forth. And I think that this is what history ought to be, to a certain extent, understanding the meanings that these have gone through in the political context.
I'll put up a link to that, too. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 13th week of 2013. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been our Liberation and Occupation edition for Passover and Good Friday. If our program interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of the program can be found on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.